Good afternoon YouTube and welcome back to episode 5 of Project RS125. In today's issue we are going to be sorting the front brakes, cutting lots of seized bolts and more seized bolts and restoring the rear subframe. Now I do apologise for the delay on the upload. I've been working on the R1 on the bench and I've been away with Nex in Portugal, which I'll link at the end of the video. But let's get the RS125 back on the ramp and let the work begin. The first job on the to-do list was rebuilding the front brakes. As we did in the last episode where I redid the rear brakes, we're going to be going with the same approach, and thankfully it is pretty straightforward, as I'll show now. With the front brake caliper removed, we can then remove the reservoir. As seen here, again, really straightforward to do. And once that plastic piece of trim is removed from the bottom yoke, you can pull the full system out complete, meaning you don't have to bleed it or anything before taking it on the bike, which is ideal. First impressions, that front brake caliper didn't actually look that bad, but when it's removed from the bike, just like the rear, you can see all the powder coat flaking, the rust on the brake pads, the seals are all perished, so we do need to do a full rebuild, which thankfully we have in that kit again. So essentially, the easiest way of doing this is once it's off the bike, remove all the brake fluid via the vacuum pump, because if you just remove the hose now, it can make quite a mess, and it's certainly easier just bleeding it all off the system. The reservoir certainly didn't look fantastic, and even on the rubber on the cap there was debris on there. I don't know what it was, but the good news is nothing was perished, which means everything could be cleaned up and reused again. I was surprised because I was expecting this to be potentially deformed or just old and brittle, but it wasn't. It was fine, as you can see here. So I cleaned it all up and treated the reservoir pot itself to some brake cleaner and a cloth, and I must say that also came up really well, because I thought again I was going to have to start using bleaches and stuff to try and neutralise the yellow in it, but it looks absolutely fantastic. So a quick look at all the parts we've got to put the front brakes together. Again, if you watch the previous episode, it's going to be a lot like the rear. So we've got EBC pads, not my go-to choice, but we came with the kit. We've got the caliper, which again, I don't know whether this is some sort of coating. It's obviously in very good order compared to the one that was on the bike. We've got my go-to Hell brake lines, new bolts, washers. There was also a brand new brake lever in there as well. We've got the original pistons, which have cleaned up really nicely, no pitting or corrosion on those. Brand new seal kit for the pistons, new seal for the master cylinder, which I think you can see in there. Not much left of that. We've got the seals between the calipers, the new bleed nipple, the bleed nipple ball bearing, bleed nipple cover, and the Stone Automotive refurbished reservoir with new clips. So yeah, I'm not going to do a step-by-step on this one because we've done it in the rear, but you'll get a time lapse of it all going back together probably tomorrow now, because it's nearly din-din's time. So it's a lovely sunny day in the UK. Obviously when you last saw me 2 evenings ago, I think it was, I laid all this out ready to go. So that's today's mission and some true tinkering. I've also put all the engine parts in a box because they were just sat up on the bench. Not ideal really. So we can close them off, keep them safe. I've also got some red coolant hoses. I think it's going to look pretty tricky in there. I mean, obviously you can't really appreciate them in the bag, but it's going to look nicer than the black ones, we hope. But again, we've got lots to get on with. We've also got the disc, the old one, and the new one, well, newish one to me, that's off of the donor as well, which looks a million times better than that one. So yeah, we've guess less waffling and got to crack on. The front goes together just like the rear did, but you have got different size pistons in the front one compared to the rear, and you've also got 4 compared to 2, so do check the dust seals are the right ones going into the slots when you put it together. As per the previous video, I've also used red grease. Now, a viewer in the last episode said that you shouldn't use red grease on seals because it weakens them, it causes them to expand. I'd never heard of this. I know plenty of people that use red grease to build calipers, but I did do some digging because I was concerned myself. Even though after all the years of using them in the M3s, using it rebuilding the Clio brakes, never had a problem. I'm pleased to say the grease that I'm using is fine for dust seals and brake caliper seals, but it appears there are certain red greases that can cause damage to rubber. So do your homework, or alternatively, you can use brake fluid to put it together. But we're going to carry on with this one and putting the red grease and installing all the calipers just like before. With all the seals in place and that little seal between the calipers fitted, you can now torque them together. Again, shown here with the torque wrench, just to make sure everything is done to factory spec. Now, the next thing we're going to move on to is fitting the Hell braided brake line. And the good news is, because I've got the old caliper, I can work out the location of what way it needs to be so that we don't have to try and guess it all when it's back on the bike. It's going to be exactly as it was removed, and as can be seen here, we're ready to go. I am going to require some parts from that rough red caliper to get my new one built up, such as the pad retaining pin and the plastic dust cover. They weren't looking fantastic when removed, but the good news is, with a little wire brush, we can bring them back to a suitable usable standard, which you can see here. And then once it's all done, I then treat everything to my one and only ACF 50 to try and preserve it for many years. But it does look really good once restored, and I'm pleased to report all the pads slide freely on the pin to be able to use it. I'll be reusing the master cylinder, but we do need to remove that rubber hose from it. Now, ideally, you'll do this when it's on the clip-on, so that when you undo that banjo bolt, it doesn't put any damage on the master cylinder because it's securely clamped on. But as I'm not going to be reusing that bent brake lever, I simply put that in the vise to crack it off. Sadly, I didn't get all of this on camera because I was losing interest in it fast. So the lever bolt for the brake lever, as you can see, heavily corroded. Ended up having to open the head up with a grinder, building something out of one of my chisels that I could then put a 10mm spanner on. It just turned into absolute headaches. So I'm going to need to order a new one of these. Thankfully, no damage to the master cylinder as a result. It was just time consuming and patience, but look at that corrosion. So I'm going to clean this up and obviously just use this to hold the brake lever in place, but we will order a new one because that looks pretty shite, doesn't it? So yeah, pleasures of working on old bikes, but yeah, it's taken half an hour to get one bolt out. Armed again with the trusty wire brush, I restored that bolt and removed all the corrosion, and I thought, maybe a quick lick of paint after sanding it might be alright. The good news is it actually turned out really well. So I continued on with cleaning up the master cylinder, removing the brake switch because we're not going to need that, and covering everything in ACF 50 to give it the protection and that brand new look again. Once that was done, I then lubricated the bolt with some bearing grease that will hold the lever in place so that it's nice and free and hopefully no more corrosion. With the master cylinder and brake caliper looking factory fresh, it was then time to put the Hell braided brake line on to the master cylinder using the new banjo bolt, and then torque everything up again, making sure it's all in factory spec. The only final steps are then to reinsert the new pads and the retaining pin and the dust cover, which is all pretty straightforward as you'll see here. And I must say, I'm really thrilled with how the brakes have come out on this, especially as I had all the parts, including the seals, on the shelf included in the spare donor bike. Final thing was simply to put all the loose nuts and bolts into the relevant places, such as the reservoir and the brake caliper, because it's going to start getting confusing with lots of nuts and bolts around the workshop. But with that said, look at it, awesome, well chuffed with how that bit's come out. So the next step is to dig another box out the shed and put it in the brake box, because ideally when I start putting this all back together, I want everything clean and organised so I don't get covered in dust while I'm working on everything else. Next we move on to the front fork rebuild. The seal was gone and they were looking quite a state, so it certainly needed to be replaced. And with this job you're going to need to suspend the front in the air, so we can't have it on the paddock stand. So essentially I get the bike winched up onto the roof of the garage. Asbestos, so not ideal, definitely didn't want to move it around too much, but the steel frame holds it nice and secure. I need to get the V-brace out of place and I don't want to damage this because I'm going to need it for the race bodywork. Unfortunately, because of where it's located, it picks up a lot of crud on the road and the bolts are completely seized. So I end up having to get the grinder out because it just will have none of it being removed. So we're going to definitely have to order some replacements there. I can then simply unscrew the speedo cable from the speedo drive and then it's on to remove the front fender, which should be a pretty simple job, you would think. But unfortunately, again, on an old bike where corrosion has got to the threads, something this simple should not be causing me this much headache. The other three also thankfully come out nice and easy. The problem now is I've got a snap stud in the lower fork. So what I need to do is try and put a little edge on it using the grinder so I can grip it with some pliers, and what I thought would hopefully wind out was not the case. You might have been able to get a bit of heat in there, but from past experience you just end up breaking all the coating on there. For me, it wasn't worth doing. So I soldiered on, and obviously with it removed from the bike, we'll address this issue later on. Removing the front wheel on the Aprilia RS125 is pretty straightforward. You undo the big nut on the right hand fork leg, and then on the bottom of each fork leg you've got 2 pinch bolts. Remove these completely and then the spindle will slide out. If it's being stiff like mine was, you can wind the nut back in and then give it a few taps with a hammer, which will then allow it to move out of the fork legs. And with that done, it all falls out, and the speedo drive as well. We get our first look at those leaky fork seals. It's clear they've been doing that for some time. So the first thing we need to do is break off the blue caps at the top of the forks, because if you do this at a later time, you're going to have to try and put them in a vise and risk damaging the tube. So essentially, while it's clamped in place, it's the best time to undo them. With those caps loosened off but not undone, we then need to actually remove the forks from the bike, and there's 3 bolts on each side of the fork which is into the yokes. With them undone, the fork tubes will slide out. A top tip is to hold the fork while you're undoing the last one, otherwise it can simply fall out, smash into the floor or on your toes. Definitely not something you want to do on this job. With both fork tubes removed from the bike, it was time to clear the workbench. Unfortunately, because of that snap bolt in the front fender hole, I'm going to have to get the drill out and use a punch to try and centre it as best as I can. I really hoped again this was going to be pretty straightforward, but as with all the jobs done today, it wasn't going to plan. But we gave it our best shot. Sadly, as a home DIYer, it doesn't always go to plan, and today was another one of them days. It's proven a bit of a challenge, this episode, if I'm honest. So, because the bolt's obviously steel and the lower fork leg's like a cast alloy, it's obviously softer and it's let the drill run and sort of gone off track a little bit. So what I've done is just drilled it all the way through, and we're going to nut and bolt it, because you can put a bolt on the back, there's enough room, and it is only holding the fender. So no real drama, but we are going to obviously continue on with the fork seals. I mean, that one is pretty dire, and as you can see here, this one's been leaking for some time, so in desperate need of doing, and some fresh oil. With the forks on the workbench, the first job is to remove those blue caps, and this is why it was important to undo them while they were clamped in the yokes, because you'd have a right nightmare trying to hold them and undo it on the bench now. With that done, you can then start pulling out the spacer and the collets with inside the fork tube and draining all the fork oil out. I'm going to be honest, this stuff smells pretty gross, a lot like gearbox oil. Definitely don't want to get it on you, not that you want to get any engine or gearbox oil on you, but it's certainly not a nice one. And once that's all drained out, you can then examine all your parts. And as you can see here, the fork stanchion thankfully looks pristine with no pitting or rust, because if you have got damage on the stanchion, it's going to destroy the new seal. The dust seal props out pretty easily with a flathead screwdriver, and then it's simply a case of removing the retaining spring inside the fork tube, and then you'll be able to see the actual main seal itself. Now this you have got to be a little bit careful with, because you certainly don't want to damage the fork tube, so I used a little bit of cloth just to protect it and a few little love taps just to pop the seal out. Thankfully the fork bushes all seemed in good order with no marks, so we don't need to replace those along with the other components on the forks. It all looks good. So it's then simply a case of moving on to reinstalling the seals, and this again another nice straightforward job if you take your time. Using, I think it was a 36mm socket, it was roughly the outside diameter of the new seal, which allowed me to press it in nice and square. Thankfully, putting it all back together is as simple as switching the process round in reverse. Put all the new seals in, the new dust seal, the retaining clips, etc. And also make sure you put a bit of oil on the seal so that when the stanchion slides back in, it doesn't catch or drag. And do make sure it's nice and clean, because the last thing you want to do is damage that new seal when it goes in place. You can now reinstall new fork oil. I use 10 weight, which is the factory spec. I didn't really have any desire to change it. If you wanted to go a 15 weight or a 20 weight, you can make the forks a little bit thicker, which slows the compression and rebound. Not something, again, I wanted to play with. We'll just try it out for standard now, and it's 430 millilitres per fork leg. The good news is the other fork leg is exactly the same process, so I'm not going to record all that again, but boom, just like that, we've got two pristine, clean fork legs ready to go on the bike when reassembly begins. The rear subframe was looking far from perfect. Lots of surface corrosion showing through that was really unsightly, especially as when this goes back together, it's going to be looking pretty tasty under there, so I certainly wanted to make a good dent on it. I start by removing the sticker, and whilst pulling it apart I think to myself, surely they could have put an alley rear subframe in this, because this thing is heavy. But yeah, let me know, anyone seen an alley rear subframe around? Until such time, this I'll have to do. Maybe we'll chop it down at some stage, who knows, especially as we're not going to be carrying any pillions. I tried to use the trusty wire brush on the drill. This has done me well so many times, but it just wasn't touching this rear subframe. And then I remembered I had something pretty dirty in the drawer that I found in my partner's mum's garage. Yep, it definitely looks like a zombie apocalypse tool, but the good news is it works double fast in stripping everything back down. And as I said, this video, or this series so to speak, isn't going to be a nut and bolt restoration concourse. You've seen the best one ever built. This is surely showing you what can be achieved at home, and I really hope that's what's coming across in this video. Is I could easily go, let me drop this to the powder coaters, let me drop this to the painters, but what we're doing here is everything in-house, and little steps like this can be done at home. Granted, not to the standard of a powder coater, and it's not an RC30 that's worth £30,000, maybe it will be one day. But for this sort of project where you just want to spruce it up and make it look decent again, it's certainly the best option, I think. With the worst of the rust now removed, it was time to get some primer down. Now, if you were to leave this a couple of days, potentially weeks, depending on where it's stored, you are going to start seeing surface rust again. So I'd certainly make sure that if you are going to go through the same sort of process, that you have it ready to get primered once it's all been sanded back down. Now, essentially for me here, I put the first layer of primer down. It's then using the trusty hairdryer just to try and bake it, because it's not boiling hot outside. And then once I've given that 15-20 minutes to be sort of tacky touch dry, I lay down another coat. And as you can see from the primer, I'm pretty chuffed with that, especially as I'm painting it outside in what appears to be a wind tunnel down the side of the house. Now the bodywork, we're going to have to do a little bit different because you can get contaminants in the paintwork. But for this, it's not on show. I just want to make sure it looks nice when it all goes back together. I then apply 2 coats of black to the rear subframe. I consider doing it silver so it could potentially match the frame, but you don't see a lot of this. So again, hit it with a nice 2 even coats, got the trusty hairdryer out, and yeah, I'm really pleased with that, especially when it was in the state it was before with surface rust coming through everywhere. Let's just hope and see how durable this layer is on there now and how many years it's going to last. That wraps up episode 5 of Project RS125. Obviously still got plenty to get on with, but hopefully as you can see, it's really coming together now. The forks look fantastic, obviously not leaking anymore, which is a big bonus, and that rear subframe is sorted. The front brakes have been rebuilt. We've also gone ahead and gonna go with a GRP1 full fiberglass kit. I mean, there's gonna be more of this coming obviously when we go into the painting, but it looks like it's going to be perfect for the job. So yeah, plenty more still to come. If you have enjoyed it, make sure you hit that like button, consider subscribing. Until the next one.